Okay, for the lungs, so the bronchial tree comes down into the various sections. You'll notice in the lungs that the uh, right lung has three lobes. There is a superior lobe, a middle lobe, and an inferior lobe. The left lung only has two lobes, superior and inferior lobe, and there's a notch here for the heart to fit in, and it's called the cardiac notch. Now, when you look at a picture like this, it's a little bit of it creates a fallacy that the lobes are one's bigger than the other, that the superior lobe is bigger than the inferior lobe. They're actually about the same size. The inferior lobe is found behind. It comes all the way up to here behind the superior lobe. And the same with the middle, comes up to here. It's about the same size as the superior. And the inferior comes behind. So they're kind of layered here, and all the lobes are about the same size. Okay, so in the conducting zone, the bronchi get smaller and smaller and smaller until they become bronchioles. And what distinguishes the bronchi from the bronchioles is that the cartilage gradually goes away. At first it's rings, then it turns to plates, and then by the time it gets to bronchioles, there's no more cartilage. The epithelium gets thinner as well. It goes from pseudostratified columnar with cilia to a cuboidal epithelium. Very few cilia and or goblet cells by the time we get further down. The walls become more like arterial walls, and there's smooth muscle so that we can constrict or dilate the bronchioles. And this is still the conducting zone, so respiration doesn't take place here. But after the last bronchiole, and the last bronchiole of the conducting zone is called the terminal bronchiole, the next bronchiole is respiration actually happens in it. There's capillaries, and gas exchange happens through the walls of these, and so they're awful small. These are called the respiratory bronchioles. This gives way to these things called the alveolar ducts, which are, again, part of the respiratory zone, and then the alveolar sacs. So these are clusters of individual alveoli. All kinds of alveoli in the lungs. Huge amount of surface area, over 300 million alveoli in the lungs. So it ends up looking like this. The last bronchiole, the terminal bronchiole here of the conducting zone, gives way to these respiratory bronchioles. Now in this picture they look about the same because the blood vessels aren't in this picture. These are completely covered in capillary beds to facilitate gas exchange. These are the alveoli, so each one is an alveolar sac here. Alveoli means berry or grape, and so they look like bunches of grapes, and that's why they're called that. There's a duct runs up the middle of it, and each alveoli is attached to it. And this is where the majority of gas exchange actually happens. When we look at it in cross section, the duct leads into the first few alveoli, and then these alveoli all open up through pores into the next alveoli. And again, it's to facilitate surface area, because the surface area enhances diffusion. The walls of the alveoli and the walls of the capillary that is in contact with the alveoli is what the gases actually have to diffuse through. So we call this the respiratory membrane. It's very, very, very thin. The thinner the better. So it's really, the respiratory membrane is made up of the alveolar and capillary walls and the fused basement membranes of those. They're really squamous epithelial cells. Now, there's a couple of different types of cells in the alveoli, type 1 and type 2 cells. It's the type 1 cells that make up the respiratory membrane. The capillaries come and they surround each alveolus, like that. There's a photomicrograph of that. The alveoli themselves, these squamous epithelial cells, are surrounded by some elastic fibers, which gives it the rubbery, they act like balloons, so they need to have elastic. Air pressure equalizes through them, through the pores. And there are macrophages that live in the alveoli, and they eat any debris that gets deposited in the alveoli. So it's the third type of cell that's there. The macrophages are running around here. Now, the squamous epithelial cells here and the capillaries here form the respiratory membrane. The type 2 cells are cells, they're secretory cells. They're thicker, these green ones here, and they secrete something called surfactant. And the point of surfactant is that it breaks up the adhesion of water molecules. In class, when we get a chance after the break, I will demonstrate how surfactant works. I have a little demonstration that I do that will make it all make a lot more sense. But the surfactant is used to break the surface tension of the water, and it's the surface tension of the water that makes the alveoli difficult to expand. So it actually makes the lung easier to inflate. When babies are born prematurely, the last thing that develops in a fetus is the lungs. They have no need of their lungs until they're ready to be born because they're not breathing. The last thing of the lungs to develop are the surfactant secreting type 2 cells in the alveoli. If a baby is born prematurely, they may not be making enough surfactant and they have difficulty breathing. That's why you put them in an incubator, and the moist air that's put in there has surfactant added, so they end up breathing the surfactant, and it facilitates breathing. It makes breathing easier. Without surfactant, the lungs are very difficult to inflate, and breathing is a very difficult thing. A lot of times, people that breathe chlorine a lot. So I had a patient that was a competitive swimmer, and he breathed a lot of chlorine, and he ended up hurting the surfactant secreting cells, and he ended up with spontaneous collapsed lungs on 2 or 3 different occasions. And it all comes down to that. So the lungs themselves occupy most of the thoracic cavity, any place that's not the mediastinum. So they go from the apex right up under your collarbone down to the diaphragm, from the costal surface, which is against the ribs, front, back, and side, and then there's the side that's facing the mediastinum. So that's called the root. In cross section, it looks like this. So the lung is here. Now, uh, the part that's right up under the collarbone is called the apex. The base is sitting right on the diaphragm. Um, the root has a notch in it called the hilum, and that's where the blood vessels, the bronchi, lymphatic vessels, nerves all go into it. I've already mentioned the cardiac notch. It's only on the left lung, only found in the left lung. The left lung, it tends to be a little smaller, has two lobes. The fissure between the lobes is called the oblique fissure. The right lung has three lobes, and there's an oblique fissure and a horizontal fissure. Each lobe is divided up into segments by connective tissue, uh, and each segment is divided up into lobules. And so each lobe is supplied by a lobar bronchi, the secondary bronchi. Each segment is a tertiary bronchi. Each lobule is the fourth level, a lobular bronchi. And the same with blood vessels, and the same with nerves, and the same. So the tree gets reproduced. Now, the lung is also surrounded by a serous membrane. It's called the pleura. There's a cavity between the two layers of the pleura. It's a double wall, the same as all the other organs we've talked about. The visceral pleura is actually attached to the lung. The parietal pleura is attached to the chest wall, and the space between it is the pleural cavity, and that's filled with pleural fluid. And that is of very large importance. This is looking at the different levels of the bronchial tree. The blood supply is in pulmonary circulation, is pulmonary arteries deliver deoxygenated blood, then they branch right along with each bronchi until they get right down into the respiratory zones, where the capillaries pick up, and then the pulmonary veins go back to the left atrium of the heart. But the lungs themselves are living tissue, and they need to be supplied by a blood supply. They need to get oxygen and nutrients from arterial blood. So there are bronchial arteries that supply the walls of the bronchi and the interstitial tissue of the lungs themselves. This is a branch of the systemic circulation that branches off of the aorta and enters the lung, and there's a whole separate set of capillaries that will supply the tissue of the lung. Everything except for the alveoli. And then that's all picked up by the bronchial veins. Now, the bronchial veins anastomose with the pulmonary veins, and so the bronchial veins are not very well developed. Some of the bronchial veins end up back in the vena cava, but most of the blood that is supplied by the bronchial arteries ends up in the pulmonary veins and goes back to the heart, to the other side, to the left side. So it mixes with freshly oxygenated blood. There's not a lot of it, so it's not that big a deal. The pleura, like I said, a serosa, it's double layered, parietal on the thoracic wall, the visceral on the lungs. The fluid fills the cavity. it, the fluid does two things. It provides lubrication, but it also provides a surface tension, and it's what helps keeps the lung inflated.